Hi YouTube, it's Kathy, and this is my weekly entertainment wrap-up for April 30th to May 6th. This week I read 3 books, I watched 3 TV shows, I watched 1 movie, and I listened to 1 book. First this week I finished Crest by Marissa Mayer, which is the 3rd in the Lunar Chronicles series. I'm having a lot of fun reading this series, and I find the characters delightful. One of my favorite things is how often the perspective shifts, giving the reader a chance to really get to know all the characters. It's also fun when new characters are introduced and established characters are doing something odd that the reader understands, but the new character doesn't. For example, Crest notices Wolf cradling a can of tomatoes, which is a super weird thing to do, unless you know his backstory. I'm also very intrigued to read the final book of this series, Winter, as the titular character was introduced in this book, and I think that Mayer will have a lot of fun wrapping up the series. I think I'm also going to try to read more standalone books in the near future. I've noticed that while trying to give non-spoiler reviews, what I say basically amounts to I like this book for very vague reasons. If you talk about books on the internet, do you have the same conflict of trying to be low spoiler but feeling that you're not saying anything of substance? I would really like to talk about this down in the comments below. Next, I finished Jessica Jones' Alias Volume 1, which was written by Brian Michael Bendis and illustrated by Michael Gaydos. So proud of myself for not saying Matthew Gaydos. This is the first Jessica Jones comic that I've read, and this issue started out with the same opening as the TV show, so I thought that I might have picked up an illustrated version of the TV show, but fortunately the plot was very different. Not that I didn't love the plot of the show, but I was hoping to read something other than the show. Lots of snark, lots of mention of other people with powers, and a lot of plot twists. There's just so much to pick up in the comic world that I feel daunted by having to know everything about a character, so I find it a lot more fun to just dip into characters now and then. Lastly, I finished Fallen by Karen Slaughter. This follows Faith, who is a Georgia Federal Bureau agent, and she's rushing home to pick up her infant daughter, who is staying with the agent's mother. Problem is, Grandma isn't picking up the phone, hasn't left any messages, and it's freaking Faith out. She's also newly diabetic and hasn't eaten in far too long, so is second-guessing her panic over not being able to contact her mom, until she arrives and finds blood on the scene. I picked this up at an independent bookstore during my Books and Beer tour last September with my mom, and at the time I had no idea it was the 5th in a series. That being said, it was easy to jump into this because any relations between characters that were important for the reader to know were explained. Slaughter really lets you know the inner workings of your character, which makes a almost 500-page paperback go in a breeze. There's mystery, intrigue, secrets, and intense character relationships all during the worst few days of somebody's life. This week I finished the 6th and final season of Private Practice, which just feels strange. It's the only Shondaland show I've seen the end of because the rest of them are still on the air. This was a 13-episode season, and you could tell they were trying to wrap up as many storylines as possible, so I gather they knew that they were ending. That being said, there was still a lot of heartache, there were still a lot of things that made me cry, and I kept looking at Amelia's relationship with Glee, even though I know from watching Grey's Anatomy that it doesn't go very long. Not everyone gets a happy ending, but you're left with the sense that those that don't are still going to be okay. As for The Walking Dead, we watched Season 5, Episodes 9 to 11, and Rick said the name of the show. Chad and I both looked at each other and said, "He said the name!" Throughout, I have been amazed at how the different groups of people have come up with different names for what we would call zombies. Walkers, biters, roamers, creepers, dead ones, lurkers, and rotters, just to name the best ones. Slight spoiler in the latter half of this sentence, but I was amazed to find out that The Walking Dead refers to the protagonists and not the walkers. I'm still waiting for Jeffrey Dean Morgan to show up, so every time they meet new people, I look on expectant, which is the downside of looking things up on the internet. Instead of focusing on what's happening, I get drawn into what could happen next. I suppose that's a decent survival mechanism, but it's a pain in the butt when you're watching a show. I also watched an episode of Survivor this week, and surprise, surprise, somebody else was blindsided. For once, I would actually like to see an alliance stick together for a few episodes, picking off people from the other alliance. But that never happens. This week, I also watched Eddie the Eagle. Here's the thing about me. I don't really care for watching sports, but I love sports movies. I like them even more when they're based on a true story, and I'm a sucker for an underdog, so this movie was right up my alley. It was also fun to see Hugh Jackman in a role where when he gets punched, he doesn't ultimately come out on top. One of the problems I have with sports movies is they rarely have many high-quality female characters, unless you're talking about Bend It Like Beckham or the plethora of dance movies, which are for some reason not a sport, but golf is. Also, I love the low-key mention of the Jamaican bobsled team because of course I've seen Cool Runnings, although even though it's based on a true story, I gather most of it's fiction. I can't get into watching a sport for any length of time unless there's a story behind it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. This week I listened to The Voyage of the Basilisk by Marie Brennan, which is the 3rd in the Lady Trent memoir series. Can we just take a minute to appreciate Todd Lockhart's cover art? If I had more wall space and money, I would order each of his series full covers and put them up in my house. There are so many types of dragons in this series, and I love that Isabella is literally traveling the world to find as many as possible. And it's not for sport, it's for love and understanding. There's always a culture clash subplot in these books, and this one involves Isabella having to marry a woman for a short amount of time, which was a delightful study in gender roles and gender expression. I love that Jake is along on this adventure and how excited he is to get to learn how to sail. More than anything, this series makes me want to go on all the adventures. I've already picked up In the Labyrinth of Drakes from the library in print, because even though the audiobook exists, my library doesn't have access to it yet. I'm sure Kate Redding's voice will still be in my head as I read it, much like when I read the Night Vale novels, Cecil's voice is in my head. That's it for now. This week I want to know your favorite series. It can be a TV series, a book series, a podcast, whatever you want. It's a tough question because I can never narrow it down to a true favorite, but just stick to your gut. On the way down in the comments, if you hit that subscribe button, that would be very nice of you. You can like and share this as you see fit, and I will see you next week, possibly from a different location. Bye!